All right. Well, hey, we are back. Another COVID conversation. I am with Mark Sperber again. Mark, just for a refresher for people, you are a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family counselor, and you're awesome. So thank you for taking some more time out to do this.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here, Josh.
So last time we talked, we really talked, we spent a lot of time talking about stress, sort of the COVID and what this is doing, and that we sort of have this primal response to these kind of stressors, almost like we're being attacked by something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that a lot of what we're feeling, these stresses we're feeling, and we talked early on in COVID lockdown about that these being normal, but as this has gone on longer and longer, we're seeing some different responses to that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is sort of like as this thing elongates and we spend more and more time isolated and more time uncertain, it changes things. Because we were talking earlier and you said this, which I think is fascinating. It says the brain wants an end date.
Mm-hmm.
And so could you speak, what is, like, when we're feeling all these things, it's not just because we're feeling it like emotionally, there's something inside of us that is like pressing.
Yeah. I think, and I'm going to speak in a very general way, but like, if we look at our brain, it's this wonderful problem solving word machine, right? It's always offering us stories about our futures, memories about our past, how to fix this, how to be a better person, et cetera. And in a lot of ways, that's really helpful. It's helped us be the dominant species on the planet. However, it carries a shadow side, and it's that problem solving word machine that, okay, how do we solve this problem? And there's ways that that's helpful for us. But this ongoing ambiguity is actually stressful in and of itself. We don't know exactly when the next thing is going to be, when life's going to be, quote unquote, back to normal regarding that. And it's this invisible threat that's been so hard for us to kind of cope with.
And so that's when we start to see like burnout, and you had used the words compassion fatigue as well, because everyone is affected. It's not equal effect. I mean, so we're all suffering at some level, psychologically, emotionally, fear about tomorrow, sort of longing what was yesterday. But there is a real fatigue that begins to play out.
Yeah.
And so as we look at that, it can present itself, and this is, and I hope you can speak to this, sort of in these like low levels of depressions, that depression that begin to build over time. And that's sort of like a natural response, right?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, going back to one of the definitions of stress, it's strain plus my perception of the strain, right? And when we start to perceive like there's more that I have to do or more, and it's constant, it really has this perception of weighing us down. And I guess one of the things that's really challenging, I would say also about psychological stressors, is kind of a lot of our stress response is designed to, hey, we see a lion, we fight the lion, or we run away, or, if we're totally overwhelmed and can't get away, we freeze, right? Those are our stress responses, and that's really baseline running underneath. Well, we have these ongoing stressors that we're facing about whether it's economic challenges or changes that we're all facing, and whether it's our businesses, or should I go out, or how do I deal with social distancing, et cetera. It's just kind of unremitting, and it's our brains and bodies aren't designed kind of, we have the immediate threat of the lion, then it goes away. And so that's one of the things that's really stretching us, I think, in a lot of ways.
Is it the line just doesn't go away?
Well, we're kind of constantly under threat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were saying also like that we want comfort. I mean, like that is a desire that we have. And this is a time where it is really difficult to find that.
Right.
And so not only are we sort of in a battle with a constant threat, but we also can't, because of that, we can't find comfort. And so that puts an undue amount of stress on an individual. And then the other thing we were talking about, you were saying that there's sort of different demographics that are paying the price for each demographic is a little different. And one of the groups of people that are really, really struggling right now, couples with young children.
Mm-hmm.
And can you explain to me a little bit about that? Because I think it's fascinating, because I mean, personally, as an adult, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this emotionally. And I sometimes forget that I have children around there that probably are going through some stuff as well.
Right. Well, I want to hold it somewhat loosely, but I mean, I guess I'm just doing a little bit of reading about all of it, that's actually one of the trends that couples with young children often have been having a little bit more stress. And part of that being the ways that maybe it's unremitting in terms of having the kids and, losses. And again, like you said, there are a number of losses in big and small ways, like the loss of a Mother's Day out, or the loss of connecting with other adults. And particularly if one of the partners has to be out of the home for a significant portion of the time, and then, okay, the other partner's with the kids all the time. That's challenging. I guess one of the things, and we were, kind of discussing it a little bit before, but just kind of one of the books I really like is How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Your Kids Will Talk. And one of the takeaways for me in it is that, that actually when kids don't feel good on the inside, they behave poorly on the outside. And if we can have kind of that frame of reference, and actually want to acknowledge, I specifically treat individuals 12 and older. And that's because my method of working with people is talk therapy. And below 12, talk isn't the main way of communicating. And so particularly for younger kids, they're going to act out rather than necessarily tell you how they're feeling. And sometimes they will, and that's awesome. But the brain isn't fully baked. And actually brains aren't fully baked until age 25. And so that's probably even true of our teenagers, or, that they'll manifest stress in other ways than telling us that they're stressed, that they may act out. And so that adds another stress, that we're all stuck at home together, and then someone's having an issue. And that's then something else to solve, right?
Yeah, and I think there's like we talked a lot about this, is there's so many losses right now. And they just begin to pile up. So whether it's a loss of autonomy, that like I used to be able to go to the store when I wanted and get what I wanted, and now I can't. It's the loss of innocence. Like my wife and I have talked about our kids, their loss of innocence is they sort of their whole lives are interrupted. And now everywhere we go, people are wearing masks, and we're talking about these things. People have lost vacations. People have lost opportunities to celebrate. They've lost the privilege of mourning with those, for other people. There's loss everywhere. Even if we have similar numbers of losses and wins, the losses are always a lot heavier than the wins are as far as the emotional toll. They sort of weigh a little bit more. And as we see this, and so we're looking we want comfort, we can't find it, we're in sort of constant stress. Even if we are being productive, working from home, it's not at the same level as when we were in the office, maybe. And if we're doing it really well, we're probably not doing great on the parenting front. And then we feel guilty about that. Mm-hmm. I know that if there's a day I have a lot of meetings and I just say, okay, the kids have screens all day, so I can figure out all the Zoom stuff. And then I feel guilty the rest of the night because I gave them, 5 hours of screen time. Yeah. It's never ending. And as we look at that, we talk about that, there's a real tendency here to isolate. Even I think inside our marriages is to sort of like pull apart because we're operating at levels of stress that we've never experienced, and isolate. And one of the things I found fascinating is you were saying that looking forward, like in the next couple of years, the effects of the emotional and psychological stresses of today could really have a big impact in people's physical health. Yeah. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is pretty fascinating, and actually it's fairly old research at this point, but Ray is the name, R-A-H-E, and they did a scale, and it's talking about stressful events. And so actually even positive changes like getting married, right, or buying a home are all stressors, right? And so I guess just want to speak to, even if we're appreciating and glad we have more time with our partner at home, our rhythms are totally thrown off. How we do what we do, and we're talking best case scenarios here, right? There are, for some of us, some silver linings in these changes, where maybe we're more connected with our nuclear family than running the basketball practice, or whatever that is. And even the fact that all our rhythms are thrown off, our stressors. And I guess then you add in the number of stressors that are all happening at the same time and happening to all of us. And I guess turning our attention a little bit to the couples, that's one of those where actually when we're stressed, we're more likely to be irritable, we're more likely to have a shorter fuse with each other. And where it's so vital that actually, if we can, one of the things that Gottman's talk about is actually having soft startups to our conversation. Harsh startups are, you're pretty likely to be at an argument at 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
But if you have a
If you
soft
make
startup,
it there.
if you can keep that conversation, that discussion from elevating in the first 2.5 minutes, you've got something like a 94% chance that you're not escalated at 15. That it's not going to go there. And it's those little things that it actually, when I'm irritated, instead of snapping at my partner, if I can go get a drink of water or go take 6 breaths, take a moment to think about the positive thing that they did today, and soften how I respond there. But it's hard because when we're under stress, willpower is a muscle, and there's a lot of ways that we're being taxed and asked to do the harder thing. And so that then makes it easier for us to do a less helpful thing in the moment.
Yeah. One of the questions I have for you, I mean, so you're caring for people, you're counseling, you're walking through people but you're also dealing with this.
Right.
Like, so there's that, like the personal, and so like, I think would be really helpful is to understand a little bit like your approach. Like, so how are you dealing with caring for people? Because you have to create enough space emotionally to care for others, but at the same time as going through what everybody else is going through. And maybe it'd be helpful for us to hear some of the things you're putting into practice, because I think an example is always, for me at least, helpful.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing that's showing up for me, Josh, is really holding out that I don't have to do this perfectly, and trying to have a little bit of compassion and coming back to today and doing small efforts today, but in general, one of the things that has been helpful for me is except for this last week, I did pretty well with my exercise. That exercise, actually, going back to that stress response, like when we have even these psychological stressors, if we can move our bodies, a lot of times that can really help in coping with things. The other things that I've been doing is, trying to do some of the mindfulness or centering prayer, and making space for that. And it's been nice also to reconnect. I guess for me, that was one of the really lovely things that I've been able to reconnect with old friends that somehow through this, I have friends in Michigan, and I've been able to reconnect with them through all this. So it's helped in some ways, but there's been a lot of stressors and all of it. Yeah.
I love the concept of actively treating ourselves with compassion.
Yeah.
I think that is like such a key for this season. we've talked about this, like growing up for me, at least in the evangelical church, one of the, in the West and specifically the United States, in the generation that I was a part of the church as a young teen and adolescent, sort of guilt and shame were big motivators. So having compassion for yourself was not part of the narrative or conversation. And now in a social media heavy world where we are continually comparing ourselves to the image other people put up of their lives, it is really hard sometimes not to just beat ourselves down.
Yeah.
And I love that, of the concept of actively treating ourselves with compassion and approaching it from, can I get a couple wins today?
Yeah.
Small ones, and then watch them build.
Yeah. And I actually, it's funny that we're talking today. Today I had some goals that I thought I was going to do some things and thought my day was going to go a certain way, and it didn't. And it's like, okay, there's some days it's a 40% day, and I can, all right, I be here now and do my best with what I've got. And that's, you know, I guess kind of making room for that. And just a little aside on the science behind change. Actually, one of the hard things that trips people up from changing is they aren't willing to start where they are.
Yeah.
And so that's the paradox. Is actually, sometimes we think of compassion as being soft, or, you know, it's going to be an excuse. And true compassion is, no, I'm going to be with myself as I am and start where I am today. And that actually helps me get into action and move towards who and what I want to be about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really helpful, especially as we're seeing sort of our response to stress and over extended period of time is naturally leading people to sort of a depressive state. One of the things that I've experienced personally in depression is that it is this fatality mentality that I am paralyzed. I cannot do anything. And I try to fix everything from one day to the next. And when I can't, it just pulls me right back in it.
Yeah.
And so in a season where there's an overarching sort of malaise that is falling over us as we're in this sort of seemingly unending COVID experience, having that compassion with ourselves for today, and knowing that this is a journey of 1,000,000 little steps or 1,000 little steps to get to a place of health, that's comforting, actually.
Good. I think one of the things along, you know, you mentioned depression. I think that stress certainly can trigger us to have depression or anxiety, and those are all very normal. Or actually, if you deal with mental health, like these kinds of changes and these kinds of losses can really throw us off balance, and that's for all of us. And I guess as we were talking about before, I guess you're strong when you reach out for help, right? Yeah. Like a lot of times we think it's a failure, or we have these stories in our head about that, but it actually, self-care allows us to be, it's not indulgent, it allows us to be the better husband and father, church member, you know, better person. It helps us stand with our strengths, stand with our values, right? And I guess if we point out, like, it's not about a weakness, it's about helping us be better. And so that's what I guess I would really like people to hear, that it's not, you're not a failure if you reach out for help. It's getting with your strength and hopefully helping us. And just as an aside also, you triggered my thought of, if I'm depressed, one of the two things I would say are real important. One is, if you can find some small ways that you can take action is a really helpful way to approach that. And then also, I'm going to call it jokingly the dictator within. I'm going to borrow from Steve Hayes. And actually, if we can really make some room and be aware that we have this word machine that's always constantly telling us how we could be better, or how we can fix this, how we can fix that. And one technique I personally use is I thank my mind for that thought, and that kind of changes it. So I'm really a big mess up. Okay, thank you, mind, for that thought. Okay, what can I do here and now, right?
Yeah.
And all right,
So what, and again, this is why I love having these conversations with you. For me, there's a couple takeaways, and let me know if you want to add any to them. But the first thing I see here is we actively treat ourselves with compassion. Like, that's an active pursuit that we have. We treat ourselves with compassion. And the other thing I see here is that, like, asking for help is actually the brave, courageous thing to do. It's not the last resort of like, it should be our first step forward. It takes a lot of bravery to say I need help. And in that process, like, self-care is so important.
Yeah.
And you've talked about this, you talked about this last time, but I'll repeat it again here: nutrition, exercise, sleep, which it seems to be something that is really fleeting in times of anxious times, but is so important just for the functioning of our mind and our body. And then you had mentioned before about, that we'll see if we can put this link in the description here, but there's a website of how to decide if, like, a psychologist is right for me. Mm-hmm. So, like, beyond, like, if we've done everything we can do and realize we still need some help, it's really brave to say, okay, what's the next step for me to get help?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the last thing I want you to speak to is when we were talking, because, like, it's one thing to say, we're going to get couples therapy, because listen, I think there's a lot of marriages in this season that have gotten stronger. Some of them have been pulled apart, but all of us are under stress. And if we find ourselves in a place where we keep having the same arguments over and over again, and we can't seem to get traction towards being closer, then marriage counseling is a great idea. But it's not one of those things. I made the analogy, like, when you buy a hamburger and you buy a car, you do two different types of research. Marriage counseling is more like buying a car than buying a hamburger. Could you share a little bit about just your perspective on that?
Absolutely. I guess what I would want people to hear is that, actually, in my experience, marriage counseling it's a whole different dynamic. It's a whole different thing. It's a specialty. And I would be extraordinarily choosy about who I would have treat my own marriage. And it's a different skill set, and it's hard. I guess was one of the things I would say about it, doing some of that. But I actually have some opinions, and they're just my opinions. I don't mean to speak for anyone else. But one of the questions I would ask people is, what percentage of your clients are couples therapy, and asking a little bit about their background and what trainings they've had. And for me, there's actually 3 evidence-based treatments for couples therapy. There's behavioral couples therapy. That's maybe not as common, but the 2 more common are the Gottman method and the emotionally focused couples therapy. Actually, and if you want a primer on either of those, Susan Johnson's book, Hold Me Tight, is for emotionally focused couples therapy, and the Gottman 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work. The Gottmans have a number of books, and actually for parents transitioning to And Baby Makes 3 is a pretty handy book if you're transitioning with kids, talking about those dynamics. So those would be several book references I would offer. But I would be extraordinary. I would do the work, ask around who's found good couples therapists, and really make sure that you're choosing someone with some good skills. I'd be willing to wait to get into someone very strong and willing, frankly, to pay.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna listen. I really appreciate this. This is really helpful. It's helpful for me personally, and I know it's going to be helpful for a lot of people. But I want to end on one question. in this, since we talked last time and all of this, what are you seeing? What is God speaking to you? What do you see? Because I'm really at a point where I'm trying to find the God stories around in all of this. And so I'd just be curious, what are some of the things you're seeing, the God stuff that you're seeing in the midst of all of this?
Well, I'm trying to remember if I used this analogy last time, but actually the Chinese symbol for a crisis is danger and opportunity. And I guess that's the thing that I would say that hopefully we can leverage, even though there are real threats and there's real stress and there are real challenges that we're all facing. Hopefully we can embrace some of these opportunities to change. And I guess I'm hopefully not being too political here, but that we can make a more just society, a place that's more loving and inclusive and reaching some of the ideals that I think we hold out there. How can we embrace the opportunity to be families together and to be intentional about connecting, about relationships and setting rhythms and patterns of life that work better for us as we have kind of these disruptions to our lives. And they're real challenges, and hopefully we can be compassionate with ourselves and with each other as we walk this path to really show up with our best selves. So those are kind of some rumblings in my head. I hope that's of service. Yeah.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, thank you so much. You're such a blessing. Appreciate your time. And we'll probably end up doing this again.
Okay. Well, hopefully this all magically ends and we don't, but you know.
But we can do then, the next one we can do is, what do we do with all this joy? Like what this excess joy that we're experiencing? That's the next one.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, man. I appreciate it.
See you, Josh.
See you, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye.